Thank you to all of you who have joined us today for your interest in this webinar. I think that we can just start with introductions then. Welcome to the semester's second EPRC webinar, but the 14th in general this year. My name is Linjun Xie, and I am a researcher at the EPRC. In normal circumstances, these seminars would have taken place face-to-face at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, which we look forward to doing again in the future. Nonetheless, we are delighted to be able to welcome you all a bit from all over the world in this webinar today, and hopefully for future webinars as well. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Lin Jin, who will be sharing her research and findings on the topic of mainstreaming nature-based solutions for climate and biodiversity governance in cities, which is quite a topical presentation in this time of COP26. The presentation will be for about 30 minutes, and in the remaining time, we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. So just to give you a bit of an overview of how Zoom is going to work here, if you would like to make an intervention, use the Zoom raise a hand function, or feel free to use the chat function as well. After the presentation, of course, we will address these in the discussion part. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to inform you that this meeting is being recorded, which means that you and your colleagues have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. The recording will then be made available on our YouTube channel and shared with you by email. We would also like to encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts on the webinar and spread the word on the research that Lin Jin will present. So let me present our speaker today. Dr. Linjun Xie is an assistant professor in the Department of Architecture and Built Environment at the University of Nottingham Ningbo, China. She has a background in urban planning, and her interdisciplinary research focuses on urban sustainability transitions and environmental governance. Her work explores urban sustainability innovations such as eco-city, smart city, and nature-based solutions, especially in China and Europe. She has published a number of papers in journals on urban and environmental studies, including Environmental Science and Policy, Political Geography, Journal of Urban Technology, and she is an expert, therefore, on this subject that we're going to hear on today. I thus would like to give the floor to Lin Jin. So if we could stop sharing our screen. Yes, thank you. Okay, please go ahead, Lin Jin.
Sorry, I just can't wait to share it. So you can hear me clearly and see the slides, right? Just to confirm. Okay, yeah. Great. So thanks very much, Liliana, for the kind introduction, and also many thanks to the EPRC for the invitation. And also thanks to all the audiences, especially those joining from Glasgow. I know there are a lot of exciting events happening in the city. And when Liliana and I discussed a date for the webinar, I didn't realize that it's the COP week, but I think this is a good coincidence because today I'm going to talk about climate governance and also the emerging approach of nature-based solutions. So yeah, the topic is mainstreaming nature-based solutions for both climate and biodiversity governance, especially in cities. So I will just start by explaining the term a little bit for those that are not very familiar with it. I'm sorry, I probably need to, okay, I'm just minimize the screen, otherwise I couldn't see the entire slides. So yeah, in the broader term, nature-based solutions are solutions that work with nature to address various sustainability challenges in our society. There are so many various definitions of it, and one of the popular one is defined by the European Commission, which are solutions that are inspired and supported by nature, which are cost-effective, simultaneously provide environmental, social, economic benefits, and help build resilience. So here are some examples, such as providing urban parks or green spaces for recreation to promote health and happiness of the citizens, and also tree planting to clean the air, to filter the pollutants, etc., etc. Okay. So the term nature-based solution is recognized as an umbrella term. So underneath it, it encompasses various approaches of working with nature, which are not entirely new to us, such as the green infrastructure, blue infrastructure, or providing green spaces, etc. And I think there are two features that underneath this concept of nature-based solutions, which are first inclusive in terms of the wide range of actions that this term encompasses, and also the actors it involves and the sites in which it takes place. I will show some examples in the following slides. And the other feature is that it's multifunctional, capable of addressing multiple challenges at the same time. So in terms of the inclusiveness, I forgot to mention that before I joined the University of Nottingham Ningbo, China this summer, I actually did a 2-year postdoc research in the Durham University, working on a EU Horizon 2020 project called Naturebased, looking at nature-based solutions in cities and how they can address urban sustainability challenges. So this figure is actually coming from the Naturebased project, in which as a team, we survey nearly 1,000 nature-based solution projects within European cities. And as you can see, this diagram shows that the urban settings that nature-based solutions involved. So, for example, a lot of them are related to parks and urban green areas, but also there are many projects involved blue areas such as rivers, streams in cities, and also the dynamic areas and even green indoor areas. So this actually shows that nature-based solutions involve various forms of interventions in different settings. And also it is a multi-actor dynamic, it's a multi-actor turn or solutions, because within the nearly 1,000 nature-based solutions project, we found that 44% of them are actually governed by hybrid collaboration. Hybrid means that it involves governmental bodies and also non-governmental actors. And there are 30% solely managed or initiated by the governmental bodies, and then 26.5% managed by the non-governmental bodies. And among those groups, private sectors, NGOs, and civil society organizations, as well as citizens or community groups are the most popular. So I think this actually shows us that nature-based solutions are not only led by the government, but it actually involves or can be initiated by different groups in our city. And the next feature that I mentioned is the multifunctionality. So here again, our survey demonstrates that there are different kinds of problems or benefits, problems that nature-based solutions can address, and various benefits that it can deliver. For example, providing green spaces, supporting urban regeneration, helping to improve health and well-being, etc., etc. So in essence, we look at nature-based solutions as project-based urban experimentations. And here, the project base is actually differentiated from the formal urban plans that we often use to govern the spatial layout within the cities. And so we see that nature-based solutions represents a form of governance by experimentation, in which urban sustainability is pursued through different initiatives, different projects, which bring together diverse actors. And here, the different it also involves different forms of innovation. And here I mentioned the social innovation means that different kinds of people or different modes of collaboration can be experimented within cities to help to develop urban green or nature-based solutions. And the ecological innovation is involved the recreation of existing ecosystem or to create new ecosystem within cities. And technical innovation, for example, the green roofs or even the vertical green technology that involves in nature-based solutions. So, so in essence, nature-based solutions are a form of urban innovations that can reconfigure the urban regimes towards sustainable transitions. And in terms of urban regimes, I will explain a little bit more in the following slides. So because of the great potential or promise of nature-based solutions, currently we see that the term has become more and more popular. And this is because we as the humankind is actually facing three interlinked big challenges. First is the climate, second is the biodiversity loss. This year we have the 2 COPs, which already shows that some of the green reality that we are facing today. And also we are still in the COVID pandemic, which disrupts all our lives. So human well-being is also another challenge facing by all the society. So nature-based solutions, comparing to other many engineered solutions, they have the potential to tackle both climate mitigation and adaptation challenges at relatively low cost, while delivering multiple additional benefits for people and nature. So I think this quote here actually demonstrates why nature-based solutions are becoming more and more popular, because it shows a viable way to address these various interlinked challenges simultaneously. So because of this kind of like, it's gaining the popularity and gaining the traction, but at the same time, we are seeing that nature-based solutions are not being taken up widely or broadly. The uptake of nature-based solutions should remain piecemeal, especially in cities. And here, in the COP, they created a zone called Nature Plus Zone. You can see that there's a widespread call to mainstream nature-based solutions, not only in our urban responses to climate and biodiversity challenges, but also beyond the city, in the urban and rural areas as well. But these raise 2 important questions. First is, what does mainstreaming mean in the context of nature-based solutions? And the second is how nature-based solutions can be mainstreamed to address both climate and biodiversity losses together. So that's the leading research questions of this research. So in this research, we are actually exploring the mainstreaming of nature-based solutions for climate and biodiversity goals together. And this research was conducted collaboratively with Professor Harry Barkley, Dr. Laura Tozer, and other Naturebased colleagues that I worked with in the past 2 years. And in this research, we actually examined the current understanding of mainstreaming in environmental governance. And then we will argue that, and also explain why it doesn't match the context of nature-based solutions. And based on that, we try to reconceptualize mainstreaming for urban sustainable innovations like nature-based solutions. And we argue that mainstreaming involves both normalization and the retain of novelty. Well, I will explain that in the following slides as well. So yeah, so the first thing is to examine the current understanding of mainstreaming. So generally, mainstreaming is used to signify a change in the rules of game and challenges ideas, attitudes, or activities that are considered mainstream or normal. So here, just taking the coastal management in cities as an example. So when it comes to preventing the cities from the risks of rising sea level, we tend to think about building dams and dikes. So that's the normal way of thinking and doing. But recently we see that there's different solutions suggesting that we should really protect the urban wetlands or protect or regenerate the mangroves to protect cities. So mainstream such kind of alternative is actually need to disrupt or change the previous norms that we are currently thinking and doing and organizing things. So in environmental governance specifically, the mainstreaming is often considered as a specific form of environmental policy integration. And EPI is actually means integrating one or more emerging legitimate environmental concerns into the decision-making process of existing non-environmental sectors. And here, just take the examples, for example, integrating climate policy in the land use sector, or integrating biodiversity consideration into the agricultural sector. So when we search the literature on mainstreaming, and the EPI thinking is actually the popular or the mainstream thinking or mainstream understanding of mainstreaming. However, we think that we argue that there is a mismatch between such EPI interpretation and the governance context of urban innovations like nature-based solutions. So there are 3 points. First is that EPI understanding tends to assume that there's a need to have a strong element of steering, which is initiated and led by the government. But as mentioned, the nature-based solutions are inclusive. It can lead and initiated by different urban actors. For example, as the diagram shows, it can lead by civil society, it can lead by the local community, and also by non-governmental organizations. So here's the first mismatch. And the second point is that EPI understanding tends to imply a unidirectional movement where one issue is integrated into another existing policy domain, such as that the climate into the land use or biodiversity into the agriculture. And because of that, it buries and acknowledges institutional change. So normally when people talk about mainstreaming, it doesn't involve much about changing the existing institutional setting. But what we are arguing is that for urban innovation or sustainability innovations like nature-based solutions to be mainstream, it actually needs to it actually involves a shift of the dominant thinking and doing. So that's the second point that we argue. My cat is walking in front of me, so sorry. The second point is that EPI understanding tends to focus on one specific issue. So when it comes to mainstreaming, it's either mainstreaming climate change or either mainstreaming biodiversity or mainstreaming health consideration, etc., etc. So it often overlooks the ways in which synergy can be generated between these emerging objectives, for example, climate and biodiversity, which the scientists or the researchers has demonstrated are closely connected and interlinked. So the EPI understanding of mainstreaming, we think, is too narrow for us to interpret the mainstreaming for nature-based solutions. So we look for other literature such as sustainability transitions and urban governance perspectives, where innovations like nature-based solutions are actually coming from. This classic diagram here actually shows the multi-level perspectives of understanding sustainability transitions. So it shows that in this model, it highlights the interactions among 3 levels: region, niche, and landscapes. It shows that a shift in regions or its related social practices occur in response to pressures coming from the bottom, namely the experimental niche, or coming from the external forces, namely the landscape. So, and here we explicitly look at urban infrastructure regions because nature-based solutions are part of the infrastructure systems. And urban infrastructure regimes are defined as the stable configurations of institutions, techniques, and artifacts which determine normal socio-technical developments in the city and thus shape general urban processes and the urban metabolism. And sustainable innovations like nature-based solutions are actually those experimental niche or defined as the seeds of change. And mainstreaming such innovations does involve disrupting and reconfiguring the regime to embed the new technologies, practices, and institutions. So one line of thinking suggests that, sorry, wait a second. I'm sorry, I just things like, oh yeah. feels like I'm missing one slide. Here it is. So one line of thinking suggests that experimentation or experiments or innovations come to be mainstreamed primarily through the process of scaling up, which is defined as applying a successful experiment at a higher scale level, and through which an unusual innovations become the mainstream practices. And there are various modeling or various models when researchers are studying the process of upscaling or different types of upscaling. So for example, people are looking at deepening, broadening, and scaling up. And due to the time constraint, I wouldn't go into detail on these different models. But a critique is that such understanding of mainstreaming as scaling up is actually that the achievement of significant implications of these sustainable innovations does not exclusively involve levels or scales. So it's not only replicating one successful case in other contexts or in other regions, or even in a wider scales, etc. like that. But mainstreaming is actually about changing the values and mindsets. And here, Augenstein, they did research and arguing that scaling up from an experiment or niche actually means the new ways of doing, thinking, and organizing emerge in a given system as the new normal. So drawing on these existing studies, we are arguing that mainstreaming is better or is best understood as a process through which innovations are embedded into urban systems such that they reconfigure the flow of material or even non-material process and gain momentum to transform the mainstream norms. But at the same time, to maintain the novelty as experiments or innovation. So to conceptualize mainstreaming for nature-based solutions, specifically in our study, is that we need to disrupt the region. But to disrupt the region is not easy because the incumbent regions, the existing, the vested interest with underneath it, and also the power structure, etc., and these are obdurate. They are resistant to change. And also regions comprises of different functioning domains, which are interdependent and interrelated, and each of which are comprises of a unique set of rules, norms, traditions, and rationales. And these are also quite resistant to any sudden change from the outside. And so interventions in these domains that challenge the established way of thinking, doing, and organizing actually hold the potential to catalyze wider changes and further mainstream new sustainable innovations. So for us, mainstreaming actually relies on identifying those key interventions that can offer opportunity to catalyze the uptake and support the maintenance of sustainable innovations. And so while we are looking at urban infrastructure regions specifically, we actually examine the 3 domains within the urban infrastructure regimes. And these are financial, regulatory, and urban development. So looking at the financial domain, we are focusing on, for example, the availability of funding, the willingness of the financial sectors in investing in nature-based solutions. And looking at regulatory, we are looking at those regulatory or legal framework that actually determine how urban development are governed or practiced. And looking at urban development, we are looking at the interests, practices, technologies of these urban development industries. But as the previous slides here, we said that different regions, they're actually interdependent and interrelated, and there are some overlaps, or even though they might comprise of different actors, there are some overlaps between them as well. So when we do interview within some key stakeholders in financial domain, which might also link us to some of the regulatory, for example, regulatory measures or instruments as well. So this diagram here actually shows the different dimensions that we are looking at when researching on different domains of the urban infrastructure regimes. And we are doing case studies. We studied 7 cases, including 6 European countries, the UK, Germany, Hungary, Spain, Sweden, and the Netherlands. And we are also looking at the EU level. And data were collected from their study of green infrastructure policy documents that are related to each case. And also we conducted interviews, in total 243 interviews with the key actors from different domains and from different sectors that shape the uptake of nature-based solutions. We also did participant observation and visiting those key organizations or going to events that discuss the mainstreaming or the uptake of nature-based solutions. And through this, we are trying to identify the key interventions that worked in different domains, in various contexts, that actually promote the wider uptake of nature-based solutions. So just to show how this has been done. So on the left side, the key interventions that work in practices. I listed 5 examples here coming from 5 cases. And as you can see, these involve different urban actors, including insurance firm, investment bank, and also the governmental agency, governmental sector, such as the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK, and also business, such as the Audi factory in Győr in Hungary. So throughout these cases, one of the common thing that they did, which we found has been successful in promoting the uptake of nature-based solutions, is actually they are trying to improve the data and monitoring of nature-based solutions. So in the middle, the recommended actions in each domain is actually, since we are looking at 3 domains of the urban infrastructure regions, we are analyzing this data in terms of the financial, regulatory, and urban development domain. But as you can see, there are some overlaps between different domains. So just to unite them and also to overcome those overlaps, we basically do iterative brainstorming, and then we come up with the one key stepping stone, which is improved data and monitoring. So throughout a similar process, we identified the 20 generic stepping stones that we found to be promising or pivotal to promote nature-based solutions, especially in the European context, because we did our case studies in Europe. And because the primary challenges for, and also the main actors involved in governance vary for different urban sustainability agendas. So for example, for climate, there might be involved different actors, such as the insurance sector might be the most interested in the climate risk, but not so much for biodiversity or for health. So for different urban sustainability goals or agendas, there's a variation in the key stepping stones that can, like we explained earlier, to disrupt the established domains or the region to mainstream nature-based solutions. So this is a very complicated diagram, but as you can see from the top, we did the case studies of 7 cases. We did the region analysis, which is looking at regulatory, financial, and urban development domain. And if you can see my mouse, these recommended actions is the diagram that I showed earlier, that we actually collected data from the real cases and then analyzed them based on the 3 domains. And then these 3 recommended actions together created 20 generic stepping stones. But as we mentioned, for different urban sustainability agendas, the weight or the relevance of the stepping stones might be different. So we collect data or collect evidence for climate change and biodiversity, aligning them with the recommended actions. And then you can see these are the 3 parts of the evidences. And then we did the analysis separately for the climate change. So we have the evidence for climate change, and then we have the evidence for biodiversity. And again, aligning them with the key the 20 stepping stones that we identify, we come up with the key stepping stones for mainstreaming nature-based solutions for climate change specifically. And then we also have a set of key stepping stones for mainstreaming nature-based solutions for biodiversity specifically. And then based on these stepping stones, and in the following parts, I will explain how these stepping stones come together to form the promising pathways for mainstreaming nature-based solutions for climate change or biodiversity. But here, what I'm trying to highlight is that we actually need to base on the shared or the common stepping stones between the climate and also biodiversity in order to mainstream nature-based solutions for achieving climate and biodiversity goals simultaneously. That sounds a little bit complicated, huh? So bear with me a little while. So I will just use this as an example. So individually, each of the stepping stones can catalyze change towards the uptake of nature-based solutions. But our argument is that when they are aligned with one another, so when we combine or act on those mutual reinforcing or mutual supportive stepping stones, they can create promising pathways and to generate greater momentum for mainstreaming nature-based solutions. So just taking climate change as an example, we found that create demonstration project is really helpful to promote uptake of nature-based solutions. So for example, in response to flooding, the UK environmental sector invested in a large multi-year pilot project in natural flood management. And these actually showcase or demonstrate the multi-benefits of nature-based solutions, not only responding to flood, but also creating other benefits as well. But we found that even we have the demonstration project, if we cannot value those nature-based solutions properly, especially when it comes to costs and benefits, people are still reluctant and thinking whether this actually works, whether it will be successful or not. So we think promoting or improving or creating valuation models are really is also really important as well. And there's also a case that in the Netherlands, there's a valuation tool has been developed, which actually helped to provide an estimate of the money, the monetary value associated with nature-based solutions. But even with the two stepping stones, we also found how can we widen the impact or continue the momentum of nature-based solutions is that we need to create or develop this practitioner expertise. So another example we found here is that in Germany, they create this green and white paper on urban green spaces, which actually provides a lot of suggestions for practitioners in the local context so that they can actually use those skills or use those suggestions to implement their nature-based solutions. So linking these three together, we think that assembling these stepping stones actually creates a pathway, which we call learning by doing. So, sorry. So it's actually assembling these mutually supportive stepping stones that can create this promising pathway for mainstreaming nature-based solutions for climate change. And in a similar way, we aligning different, but like I say, mutually reinforcing stepping stones together, and then they can form the promising pathways. And we identify 4 pathways based on our analysis from the data collected from case studies. And the previous slides was this one, the learning by doing, but there are also 3 other pathways that we think are promising for promoting the mainstreaming of nature-based solutions for climate change explicitly. In a similar vein, we are also doing the analysis for biodiversity. And here you can see there are 2 stepping stones that are not so relevant in the climate change analysis. The first is regulate for no net loss, which is directly speaking to biodiversity, means that any new development within the cities cannot actually cause any harm towards the local biodiversity. So they either need to preserve the biodiversity within the site or they need to offset the biodiversity loss in somewhere else. So this is the regulation for no net loss, which we didn't find in the climate analysis. And the second is promotes certification schemes such as the LEED or BREEAM that have been utilized in the UK and also in the US. And looking at the climate diagram again, we also find two stepping stones that are not included in the biodiversity, or that does not show in the biodiversity analysis, which like stimulate institutional investment for risk reduction, because it's actually focused on the climate risk. So when we analyze those evidence for biodiversity, we didn't find evidence that directing us to this stepping stone when it comes to mainstreaming nature-based solutions for biodiversity. And the second one is engage insurance sector. So comparing to climate change, insurance sectors are not so interested in biodiversity. So these are not shown in the biodiversity as well. But our argument is that when we are focusing on one sustainability goal, for example, the climate change, addressing climate change, we might neglect the other co-benefits that can generate it by implementing nature-based solutions, or even do harm to, for example, biodiversity. So a lot of the climate initiatives has been advocating for planting trees, but sometimes the local actors might adopt those monoculture, single species afforestation, which will cause more harm than good to local biodiversity. So focusing on one specific area has a lot of risks. And what we are arguing is that to mainstreaming nature-based solutions for climate and biodiversity together or simultaneously, we need to based on those stepping stones that are shared by both goals. And here we identify those shared or common stepping stones, and based on them, we again do the brainstorm and come up with the 3 promising pathways for mainstreaming. And this, although we are using the case of climate change and biodiversity, this approach applies to other sustainability goals as well, such as the health and well-being or economic regeneration. So this comes to the conclusion of discussion and conclusion. So again, mainstreaming sustainable innovation like nature-based solutions involves both normalization and a retain of novelty. So the normalization is to disrupt or reconfigure the current flows in cities, either it's material or non-material flows. So we should emphasizing not only the financial support or the regulatory support towards nature-based solutions, but also changing the mindsets and the perception as well. And to mainstream nature-based solutions, the pathways can be actually assembled by different stepping stones. And we already explained that stepping stones are generic forms of proven viable intervention in practices. So these are actually extracted from existing practices that are proven to be viable for promoting the wider uptake of nature-based solutions. But to mainstream nature-based solutions in different contexts doesn't mean to copy those successful cases. For example, in Germany, and then I will just use it and adopt and implement it in a Chinese city. It actually needs a process of translation. So we need to translate those stepping stones into detailed and context-specific interventions so as to promote the wider uptake of nature-based solutions. And also the key stepping stones vary from mainstreaming nature-based solutions for different sustainability goals. So for climate change, those key stepping stones will be different from those for promoting nature-based solutions for biodiversity. And then the final point is that if we want to mainstream nature-based solutions for multiple goals, means to actually achieve its multifunctionality, we need to act on those shared stepping stones. so that we don't highlight or maximize those trade-offs, but seeking the possibility of creating synergies. So this wraps up my presentation today, and these are the references, and I look forward to discussing more through the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lin Jin. That was a great presentation, and it does provide a good overview of not just the concepts of nature-based solutions, but also what can actually, how they can be better achieved in the urban setting. I wanted to open then the discussion. If anyone has any questions, please either write them in the chat or feel free to turn on your cameras and unmute. I see that you've turned on your camera, John. Would you like to make an intervention?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Linjun. That was a really interesting presentation. I had some technical problems. I'm not sure if you covered the point that I want to make or the question I want to ask. Sorry, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, and that was the sort of, if you like, the linearity of your model of mainstreaming. And I wondered whether there is a need to add a further dimension in terms of the maintenance or sustainability of integration of initiatives, because if we look at some UK experience, what we can see is that the three domains that you outlined, the regulatory, the financial, and the urban development, they're not static, or at least they're not static in the way that they are, the way they evolve. And what we have seen is that some of the pathways that were anticipated or were set up with best intentions have not necessarily been sustained. Regulations remain, but they're not necessarily enforced or followed through. Financial commitments change over time. Community commitments in the urban development domain, they can disappear. It seems to me that there is an element of possible, if we're thinking about the evolution of pathways, that there is potentially erosion, fragmentation, loss of memory, loss of learning, decommitment of institutional supports. So that there is a very, and then may return again over time, and there is rather a sort of complex, a complex evolution. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks very much for the great comments. I'm not sure it's a question or a comment, but more like a comment. And I totally agree with you that, and also want to clarify a little bit that we are suggesting pathways, but we are not arguing that it's a linear. Quite on the opposite, we are arguing against the linear thinking of mainstreaming, which like we got the different steps that we need to just follow them, and one by one we can achieve the mainstreaming. This is totally what we are against. So the pathways that we are creating is actually arguing that based on the context of different cities, like for example, in the Chinese cities, they might have different institutional settings, which might, for example, imposing some regulation might be relatively easier to be done than, for example, generating partnerships with other non-governmental organizations, things like that. So it's based on evaluating the local context and then to identify those opportunities and barriers. So this actually is a demonstration of the generic stepping stones for European cities. So if we are adding, like you mentioned, another domain, we are looking at currently finance, regulatory, and urban development. But if we add, for example, another domain on cultural domain, then we can come up with different set of stepping stones again. So it's actually demonstrating a method of thinking stepping stones based on what has been proved or what has been identified to be successful, and we are not suggesting to just use the same methods, such as have a regulation that has been implemented in Barcelona and then do it in London. We are actually doing this, suggesting these generic stepping stones, like provide a public mandate, but public mandate can mean different things in different contexts. And we are suggesting that for different contexts, for them to evaluate their opportunities and barriers, to identify those key stepping stones, and then to come up with their own pathways for mainstreaming. And you are totally right that the maintenance is really important, because the situation can change, the regulation, the regulatory context can change as well. So this pathway, this stepping stone or pathway thinking is also adaptive as well. So for example, currently, based on the current situation, we think that the pathway that I suggest, the learning by doing, is actually worked in one cities, but later on, after they achieve certain level of success, then they might need to think, reflect again, what kind of challenges that they are facing, what kind of new opportunities are actually coming up. And then they will do the re-evaluation and then come up with the other stepping stones that they need to activate, and then to gradually achieve the disruption of the mainstream thinking, and then embed that kind of innovation like nature-based solutions into the urban circulations. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, but thanks very much, a really great question.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your comment, and also to Lin Jin. Is there anyone else who would want to raise a comment or a question? Oh, I see that I have a raised hand from Robert. Yes, feel free to ask your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lin Jin. If I can follow up a little that conversation, the question and answer you just made with John. And say one of the experiences we've been working with on nature-based solutions here in Glasgow is that often we're having to relearn everything every time we're trying to work at a project. How you engage with the community, how you bring other partners and stakeholders involved is different in every context. And I wonder, therefore, how you were building into your notion of pathways this idea that experimentation might actually not be abnormal, but actually could itself be the mainstream approach, that every time it's an experiment rather than a given template that we can then use and adopt in each setting. I welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks very much. Also a great thought, and also it's really good to hear about the experiences from in the UK as well. And I think one key thought that I didn't really dive into in today's presentation is the concept of catalyzing. So we are actually arguing that these stepping stones are the key, or the main part of it is to catalyzing other stepping stones or catalyzing other changes. So for example, when we argue that it's very important to generate partnerships between different urban actors, but it's actually through these generating partnerships that activates other stepping stones, for example, developing valuation models, which is because that when we involve the insurance sector will, based on the data that they have, they got a lot of risk and cost data from their daily operation. And then they will think about how to use those data to do the evaluation, to create or improve evaluation models for nature-based solutions. So we are actually highlighting the catalytic effect of the stepping stones. So the pathway is also a demonstration about how these mutually supportive and can help each other stepping stones can come together and to create pathway. And it's true that the context has been keep changing, and some of the stepping stones might not be that innovative in a sense, but in a certain context, when we are not doing this, when we are not doing, for example, the collaboration with other partners, with other agencies, the silos exist, and then generating partnerships become an innovative thing. So it itself might not be that innovative, but in a certain context, when it's different from the normal thinking, the normal practices, it becomes something that needs to be mainstream to create the wider possibility or the environment for different stepping stones to be acted on and then create, how say, a safe environment for mainstreaming nature-based solutions. Yeah, that's just a random thought that I have currently.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Lin Jin, again. Does anyone else have any questions that they want to pose? Take this opportunity that Lin Jin is here with us. If not, I also have a question for you, Lin Jin. So you talked about then doing this research in different contexts, and I wondered if you had any sort of contrasts that you found interesting, even within the European setting, that you'd want to point out, because we find that there's so many different peripheral regions, more industrial regions. So I thought that you might want to have some comment on that.
Yeah, actually, we are doing case studies in the country-based level, so not really looking at, for example, the industrial zone or the relatively modernized area, things like that. But the comparing the different contexts within these 6 European countries, we already seen some differences already. That's why we think the context is very important. So for example, taking the green roofs as an example. So in the Netherlands, there are a lot of initiatives have been happening. So we found that they have the public mandate, they have generate partnerships among the governmental and non-governmental sectors, and also they have allocated fundings earmarked for green roofs. And in the contrary, in Germany, there is also a regulatory instrument in place to require those new developments to implement green roofs. But what we found in Germany is that such kind of regulatory methods or stepping stones is actually creating a dilemmas for the implementation of green roofs. It's because when something is mandatory, the government cannot provide subsidy for it anymore, because it's mandatory, so you cannot provide the governmental funding to support those green roof development. And this ends up, those developers will adopt relatively low quality green roofs just to meet the requirements from the government. And that is one of the challenges that we found in Germany. But in the Netherlands, as I mentioned, there are different types of stepping stones that work together. So that kind of problem is not that obvious. I'm not saying they are not facing the same problem, but it's just not that obvious in our case studies. So I think that actually shows that even for the same nature-based solutions, its implementation or the key stepping stones can be different in different contexts. And the effects will be different as well.
Thank you, Lin Jin. We're coming up to the hour, so there's just a last chance for one last question. And if no one wants to come in on this, then I will start then with the final remarks just on the presentation. Thank you so much, Lin Jin. And of course, thank you to everyone for your interest in today's webinar. Our next webinar will be November 17th on lessons for global development finance from the EU funds by Gail Hurley and Jonathan Gleaney, experts on development finance. Contact us, of course, to register for our mailing list and keep up to date on future events as well. We hope to see you again. And of course, to welcome Lin Jin maybe another time. Thank you so much, Lin Jin. Thank you to everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day then.